Hey everybody, welcome back to Texas History. This is video lecture 15, going over pages 543 through 551. We left off with Texas reform and education, and Annie Webb Blanton, the first superintendent of education in Texas that was a woman, first woman elected to a statewide office. Now we're going to change gears and talk about women winning suffrage. Now, the first thing you need to know is that suffrage is the right to vote. In Texas, at this point in time, in the early 1900s, women did not have the right to vote. And so they began forming suffrage groups that began to protest and fight for their right to vote. Opposition to women's suffrage was strong. There were many men at the time who held a misogynistic philosophy, meaning that women needed to take a back seat to men in all things, in all areas. And so there were a lot of men who believed women should just stay at home, take care of the children, cook, clean, and things of that nature. And none of those things, women's ability to bear children, take care of children, be wonderful parents, none of that should ever restrict women from having equal rights as men. I want you to completely understand that I wholeheartedly agree with women's rights. And so finally in 1918, women were granted the right to vote by Governor William P. Hobby. Now, William P. Hobby, you might recognize that name because that is the man after whom Hobby Airport is named. And so William Hobby, he told these suffrage groups, listen, he said, I promise you that if you help support me in the next election, then I will make sure that we give women in Texas the right to vote. Now, this was a huge risk for him because women, they couldn't vote at the time, or really it was a huge risk to the women because they were pouring time and effort into supporting this man. Even though they couldn't vote, they were campaigning on his behalf, hoping that he would win election so that they would gain their right to vote. And that is exactly what happened. In 1918, he won the election and granted women the right to vote. Now, moving on from women's rights, we go to the rights of African Americans and Tejanos. African Americans during this time did not benefit much from the reforms of the progressive era. And while many people were willing to be politically and socially progressive, they were not willing to progress in the area of race. And so Democrats, specifically the Democratic Party, worked to limit African American voting rights by establishing a poll tax. A poll tax was a tax that African Americans and even Tejanos had to pay in order to vote. Democrats also enforced Jim Crow laws. These Jim Crow laws enforced segregation, meaning African Americans could not drink from the same water fountain as white Americans. They could not wait in the same bus station or bus stop waiting room. They couldn't eat in some of the same restaurants as white Americans. And so segregation was enforced by the Jim Crow laws, which were brought about by the Democrats. African Americans were also subjected to violence. You had lynch mobs that were always a threat to African Americans, lynching being the process of hanging someone from a tree. And so you would have African Americans that were lynched without a trial. Terrible, unconstitutional, ungodly murder. Then you have the Tejanos, those Hispanics who lived in Texas. They were also subject to segregation and poll taxes. But African Americans, in order to fight back from discrimination, they created an organization called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which is still in existence to this day. So they formed the NAACP to fight against discrimination. In fact, one of the founding members, W.E.B. Du Bois, he founded a magazine called Crisis, which was sent out to people all over the nation, describing what was going on in the fight for racial equality and educating Americans on discrimination of African Americans and their fight against discrimination. The first Texas chapter of the NAACP was actually formed in Houston in 1912. And we kind of switch gears here to the most important African American institution was the church. They spent a lot of time in church where they could come together, worship freely, and have fellowship with one another. But the minister was especially important in the influence of these people, not only in spiritual matters, but also in political matters as well. You have reverends who speak out on behalf of the people, on behalf of their congregation. And so African American ministers are very important. You have people like Reverend Jesse Jackson, who now is not as mainstream as he used to be, but ministers, reverends, who speak out on behalf of the African American community. And so that is where we're going to stop with this chapter. You're going to have a test on Tuesday, April, I think that's the 21st, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, April 21st. You'll review on April 20th. We will not do a Quizlet Live for this chapter, so I'm leaving it up to you to study your notes, your Chapter 21 notes for your test, which is on Tuesday, April 21st. I hope that all is well, continuing to pray for you and your families in health and safety. Take care.